Welcome back to News in Focus. Now, as African economies continue to diversify and strengthen their financial systems, a key trend is emerging: the rise of Islamic and sustainability-linked finance across the continent. According to the newly released 2025 ABSA African Financial Market Index, 18 African markets now offer Islamic or ESG-related financial products, signaling a major shift towards inclusive, ethical, and long-term investments approaches. One of them, the countries that has seen that growth, is Tanzania, to the east of our continent. And to have this conversation, he's no stranger to us here on Hilaal TV. I'd like to welcome Shaheen Suliman, who is the head of Islamic Banking. Shaheen, always good having you on. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good to be on. Thank you for us.
No, absolute pleasure. Shaheen, let's talk about what are the key factors that are driving this diversification in the African financial systems.
So for us, we come out of an environment where there's global trade wars, there's armed conflict globally as well. So we come from a very uncertain economic environment. Now we speak about, obviously from a financial perspective, markets need to change, markets need to adapt as a result of that. If we look at Africa specifically, we see from the report that was issued that there's a movement from what we would typically see in capital markets of bonds, moving now to Islamic sukuk, moving to ESG type of instruments. And what's the reason for that? Is that on the continent, people are looking for alternative forms of financing. They're asking the question, how can my money be used towards something that adheres to my principles, and how can it benefit society at large? And I think it's evident from the output that we've seen as a result of the need or the demand that's coming from the continent. There's alternative type of structures or instruments that are now being issued to cater for the demand on the continent.
Shaheen, for the viewer out there that is asking, what is sukuk? What is ESG? Let's break it down in layman's terms so that by the end of this conversation, many of our viewers are saying, this is a beautiful product that I can put investment towards.
Okay, good question for us. So let's maybe start off. I use the word capital market.
Right.
A capital market is, let's call it an exchange or platform where people who require funding then utilize specific instruments like a bond to get funding, and people that have funding purchase the bond to get a return. So what is a bond, right?
Okay.
A bond, basically it's an instrument. The government wants to build a road. As an example, they'll go out and issue a bond, and by issuing the certificates, people or institutions will purchase a certificate and expect a return. So conventionally, a bond would pay you interest, and therefore, you're an investor, you want a return, and you want the interest on the return on that specific bond. Now, sukuk is an Islamic instrument, different from a bond in the sense that it's based on an underlying asset. So simplistically, let's use a practical example. In South Africa, we issued a sukuk in 2023, National Treasury. That sukuk was based by physical assets owned by the country. Based on the performance of that underlying asset, so let me step back. These assets are then placed into a special structure called an SPV. You buy a certificate, and based on the performance of that underlying assets, you get a return. So as an investor, I buy a certificate for sukuk. Based on the performance of that asset, I then get a return. So simplistically, a sukuk is a Sharia-compliant structure whereby you can invest in and get a return based on a Sharia-compliant underlying asset.
So basically, it's an instrument which would be used to have a return on it, but obviously there's funding that is involved. So it's practically, you as somebody who really wants to see a SMME or any other business for that matter, the funding there, you can use a sukuk as part of sort of a return on investment, an instrument similar to that, if I stand to be corrected.
100%. So a lot of your viewers may be familiar with Islamic investments that generate a return. Now, this is an alternative investment category where a sukuk is utilized to raise large-scale funding. In your introduction, as an example, you spoke about Tanzania.
Yes.
Now, in Tanzania, the example there, within the government of Zanzibar issued a sukuk. What was the sukuk utilized for? Utilized for the fishing industry, to promote the fishing industry in Tanzania, so the fish market. It was utilized for a cancer hospital, or it's intended according to the prospective to be utilized towards cancer hospital. There's parts it will be utilized towards developing roads and infrastructure.
Sure.
So the government issues a sukuk with the intention of raising capital for the utilization, for the benefit of, in this case, the residents of Zanzibar. And the investors that invest in that sukuk are willing to do that because they are then earning a return based on the performance of an underlying asset, which in this case was the airport in Zanzibar as well.
Shaheen, 18 African markets now offer Islamic or sustainability-related financial products. How do you see, in your view, this shaping the continent's broader financial landscape in the next 5 to 10 years, especially when it comes to Islamic banking? Because this is a huge shift, and it's a positive shift in so many ways.
So for us, the trend is reshaping Africa's financial identity. What it shows, though, is on the continent, there's demand for an alternative form of financing.
Sure.
In fact, a bit earlier, we were having a call with our head of Islamic banking in Kenya. And the one thing that he told me on the call is to say that he's identified such a massive market who have not utilized conventional financial instruments because it goes against their values and beliefs.
Yes.
So they steer clear of the financial ecosystem. But when we start introducing Islamic alternatives, they then actively participate in a Sharia-compliant financial ecosystem. So if you ask me, where do I see Africa moving within the next 5 years? I think as we start catering for more inclusive financial instruments on the continent, we will then get a lot of activity on the continent where people that were historically not involved in financial activity or in financial institution activity based on non-Islamic principles will now start coming into the market. So we're opening up a whole new avenue of solutions to people on the continent.
We're going to touch on Tanzania after the break, Shaheen, but I want to touch on this question, how Islamic finance has helped African markets attract a more diverse pool of investors and strengthen resilience against global economic shocks. You mentioned something interesting, that we have the trade wars that are currently happening, and there's uncertainty with regards to our markets. So in your view, how does Islamic finance really reshape everything? And it's always good to start off at home, and home is none other than the African continent.
So for me, I think what Islamic finance is actually doing, it's appealing to investors, like I mentioned, who do not participate in conventional markets. Yes. That's the first thing, right? Islamic finance is based on real assets. Yes. So it's based on profit and loss sharing principles. So it shields you from some of the underlying activity based on the structure of Islamic transactions as such. And I suppose lastly, what it helps us to do, it widens the investor base. It's opening up opportunities to those that were previously not looking at those opportunities because it did not align to their values or principles.
After the break, I'm going to continue my conversation with Shaheen Suliman. We're going to be touching on Tanzania, of course, to the east of the continent. And according to this report, the country's sovereign sukuk issuance was oversubscribed by 115%. So Shaheen's going to break it down to us how this happened for you, the viewer out there, just to get an understanding of how Islamic finance is really taking control of much of the market on the African continent. Do stay tuned. We'll have more for you after this break. Welcome back to News in Focus. My guest for these two segments is Shaheen Suliman, who is the head of ABSA Islamic Banking. Again, shukran so much for staying with us, Shaheen. Shaheen, the next question, it may sound a little bit overcomplicated for maybe some of our viewers. I'd like to think a lot of our viewers would maybe, get a understanding of this question. But of course, this is why we have you here, to supposedly simplify this. Tanzania's recent sovereign sukuk issuance was oversubscribed by 115%. Maybe just break it down for us. What is the meaning of oversubscribing, and why is this a good thing in this regards?
Okay, perfect. So, for my explanation a bit earlier, when a sukuk is issued, a certain number of certificates are issued.
Yeah.
So that you purchase a certificate to get to participate in the underlying.
Sure.
So let's use a practical example. Let's just say there's 100 certificates that are issued at 1,000 rands or 1,000 USD,
Yes.
whatever the underlying currency is, right? But now more people want it than the 1,000 certificates that are available. So that's what we mean when we say oversubscribed. But what does it mean? Why is it oversubscribed? It means that the product that's been made available, in this case the sukuk, is something that's appealing to investors. They believe in the stability of this instrument. They believe they'll get the return. Maybe the returns were, in some cases, the returns are great, so people want to partake of those great returns, and that's why you have oversubscription. And also, it shows that it may have been well structured, and therefore people wanted to participate in something like this that became oversubscribed. And
what does this tell us about the investor appetite for Sharia-compliant financing models in South Africa? In Africa, I beg your pardon. I mean, if we're getting an oversubscription by 115%, I mean, this could only lead to a positive road forward.
Yeah, so look, it tells us that when there's something that's appealing to an investor, something that makes sense financially, something that appeals to them when it comes to their, let's call it their ethical views, they will then they will chase after that because the returns are there and it aligns with their values and principles. So it shows when instruments are structured well, when the governance behind those instruments are great, when the utilization of those funds are for purposes that align to your values, investors will then look for return and will be willing to leave their money in such instruments.
I want to touch on South Africa, but it's not just South Africa, it's the other countries within the African continent also. Friday, and I'm sure you would have known, South Africa got off the grey list. You mentioned governance, and the fact that South Africa is off the grey list, this just further strengthens governance, and it'll further strengthen the governance on how Sharia banking is being done, not only in South Africa, but across the continent also.
Yeah, so for us, governance is the backbone that differentiates Sharia compliant products from normal products, right? So obviously there's governance across banking. Banking is a very well governed business as such, but there's an added layer of governance when it comes to Sharia compliance in the form of our Sharia Supervisory Committee in terms of our internal scholars. And their responsibility is to make sure that apart from ensuring that the product is Sharia compliant, it also caters for the needs of the customer. So we always look out for the rights and the obligations of the customer. So most definitely governance is inherent in the banking industry, an added layer of governance when it comes to Islamic finance or Islamic banking. And specifically, if we look at maybe just back to the report, the financial index report, is governance is one of those areas that have been looked at. So as governance across the continent, as regulation comes about, as governance structures are tightened, investors then also become more comfortable, more confident in placing their funds on the continent as well.
Yeah, I mean, I had a conversation yesterday with Dr. Dale McKinley, and he said that what we see with the grey list is that investor confidence will slowly get the sort of growth that we need within this country. And on that note, I mean, the fact that we have sukuk bonds that are now available, this even will strengthen it even further. And I think it's an important aspect with regards to this, because when we see this report coming out, it also comes out at a time where South Africa is off the grey list. That means investor confidence is high, and products like sukuk can now be used more thoroughly and more regularly on a much more consistent basis.
Yeah. So maybe just on the sukuk. So we've touched on the governance elements, right?
Yeah.
And per the report, you'll see a lot of African countries are now looking at sukuk or alternative capital instruments.
Yes.
But what does that mean? It means that we're As a continent, we realize the opportunity.
Yes.
As a continent, we identify that we need to have an enabling regulatory framework. We understand that there needs to be governance, and we also understand that we need to cater for the needs of our investor base, this diverse investor base that I speak about. The Islamic structures are there. The Islamic structures have been there, the universal. If we look at the Middle Eastern markets or the Far Eastern markets, Sukuk is not something new. Sukuk is embedded. On the African continent, yes, it's relatively new. You touched on briefly about Tanzania.
Yes, yeah.
In Tanzania, one of an interesting example as well is that, and I'll come to my point shortly, but just maybe one thing is that we often assume that these capital instruments are only issued by governments, right?
Right, yeah.
That would be the concept. That would be the understanding that because it's a massive capital raise, it's issued by government.
Yeah.
I came across something in Tanzania where a girls' boarding school issued a sukuk. And what was the reason for issuing that sukuk? They needed to raise capital as opposed to going for conventional funding, interest-based funding. They issued a sukuk with the intention that the funding will be utilized for girls' healthcare center.
Right.
So that appealed to people because now my money is going towards something that will help that specific school and maybe the community around it from a healthcare point of view. And the returns that were paid on the sukuk were quite appealing at that point in time. So it shows that sukuk is an underlying structure or mechanism that can be utilized for various forms that can align with the principles of ESG, environment, social perspectives, from a governance perspective as well. So there's a close correlation between sukuk, some of these Islamic instruments, as well as the principles and objectives of ESG, and it can be used wider than just from a government perspective or financial institution perspective, but it can be used at large in various scenarios as well.
There's something interesting you've brought up there, Shaheen. You said that bonds need to be obviously authorized by the government, but you've just mentioned now a girl using sukuk for funding for the home and of course various social aspects with regards to that. And it's important that we start using elements like sukuk for various sectors of society, and that the authorization doesn't have to come from government, but it can come from society as a whole. And that's a good thing, isn't it? We're not taking away, obviously, the regulations of the respective governments, but it allows a normal citizen to use sukuk so that it can better his or her community.
Maybe let me just clarify. So a sukuk is a structured investment type of instrument. And typically a sukuk or bond is issued by a government. It's issued by a government to raise capital.
Right.
But what I was referring to is a sukuk structure can be issued by a corporate. It can be issued by an institution. And in my example, it was issued by a school. So the school issued it to say, here's certificates that are available. If you purchase the certificates, this is a return that you'll get based on some tangible asset.
Yes.
And we'll use the money for healthcare center. So sukuk is an instrument that can be issued by obviously institutions, governments, but there's a wide range of uses, and it's typically something that is utilized to raise capital at scale.
Yeah, so you say the governance part is obviously coming from the government, but structurally, different.
So the regulation comes from the government in terms of who's allowed to issue it. What are the tax laws when issuing a sukuk? The governance around that comes if it's a sukuk around from a Sharia compliant point of view. What are the underlying assets that the sukuk is based on from a legal perspective? How is the SPV structure catered for? But what does it mean? It means now as more capital instruments become available to a man on the street, you have more options in terms of investments. So if you ask what will happen in the next few years, my view is that as sukuk becomes prevalent on the continent, as let's call it maybe pension funds start investing in sukuk, banks start investing in sukuk, funds get utilized for infrastructure, what happens is community at large benefits from Islamic investment coming in under the sukuk instrument. But what it also means is that now as an individual, I have a different asset class that I can invest in. So you may be familiar with the equivalent of a retail bond. What is a retail bond? Is an individual can buy a bond, get interest for the bond. A sukuk obviously is an Islamic equivalent, but as an individual, I now have a different asset class where I can invest my money, get a return from the sukuk. So in addition to what we offer, like your typical savings account or your fixed deposit, this is a completely different asset class that will become available on the continent as large. As more issuances are made, there's more opportunities then to invest.
Shaheen, Jazakallah just for that clarification, because I think I've got a better understanding of what sukuk is, because, like you mentioned, many of us would think sukuk comes from government. Obviously, the regulations and all the fiduciary parts need to come from government, but there's so much that I think the different parts of society can play as a whole in terms of investment for their communities. Shaheen, what steps can South Africa take to position itself as a leading regional hub for Islamic finance? Of course, the major banks here in South Africa have Islamic banking, of course, ABSA Islamic Banking, one of the leads within our country. But the country as a whole, where do you see us really positioning ourselves as a powerhouse, starting from Africa and then, of course, spreading across the world?
Look, from a South African perspective, I think we've made phenomenal progress. We have a very enabling regulatory environment. Yes, there's specific enhancements that can be made to make it easier, to give us ability to issue various forms of sukuk. Currently, our legislation allows us to issue a sukuk based on the ijara structure.
Right.
From a South African perspective, our banking environment is quite sophisticated. The South African sovereign has issued a sukuk, the first US dollar sukuk, over a decade ago. The recent issuance was 20 billion rands in 2023, again utilized for infrastructure funding. Now, from a sukuk perspective, we are amongst the leaders on the continent. From our regulatory perspective, we are enabling for Islamic banking, Islamic asset management, just generally the Islamic financial industry as well. There's always improvements that can be made, and as a banking association is something that we actively engage on to make sure that we have an enabling environment. And from an ABSA perspective, given our Pan-African footprint, we make sure that we have standardization across the continent. We have best practices across the continent as well. Because you would know Islamic principles are universal, irrespective of where you are. Yes, there's nuances when it comes to regulation in one jurisdiction versus another, but we make sure there's uniformity from an Islamic perspective, and we have the ability then to make Islamic banking and finance available across the continent.
Shaheen, always a pleasure having you, and shukran so much for making the time for us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
That is Shaheen Suliman, the head of ABSA Islamic Banking. That's all we have for you here on News in Focus. If you've missed today's episode, be sure to find it on our YouTube channel from myself, Ross Patel, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.